Hey guys, this is International Master Alex Astaneh with Chessfactor.com, and today I'm going to be covering the first game in our coverage of the match between AlphaZero and Stockfish that happened last year in 2018. So before we dive into the game, for those of you who are unfamiliar with these names, I want to tell you who or indeed what AlphaZero and Stockfish are. So Stockfish has for the last few years been considered perhaps the strongest, if not the strongest, traditional chess engine, and many of the top players, top masters today will use Stockfish and in order to analyze their games or, for example, to help them with opening preparation. AlphaZero, on the other hand, is a different beast altogether. AlphaZero is the product of Google's DeepMind, and DeepMind, their mission is to advance the field of machine learning. So their approach was in fact radically different to Stockfish and another traditional chess engines, and instead they allowed the machine to essentially teach itself by playing against itself when in the beginning it wasn't taught anything in terms of human input, like for example given an opening repertoire or anything like that. So it was able to figure out through trial and error and running many simulations how exactly you should play chess. So really interesting experiment, and the result was that AlphaZero won quite convincingly against Stockfish over the course of their match. So today I'm going to show you guys the first game that I've selected, and it's AlphaZero with the white pieces. So to begin with, 1 d4 is played, then d5, and c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, c takes d5, e takes d5. So this perhaps is the first moment to note. AlphaZero goes for what is known as the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation. This is the main line and perhaps the strongest approach against the Queen's Gambit decline. So the first thing that should be noted is now, if we notice, after this exchange, white has exchanged the c-pawn for black's e-pawn, and what we see is that black now has these 4 and these 3, right? So we're talking about the pawn chains, and black has a pawn chain, let me show you, 4 and 3, and white, on the other hand, has a pawn chain of 2 and 5. And so this is known as the Carlsbad pawn structure, and it affects the nature of the play over the course of the middle game quite significantly, because as a result of this structural difference, white has 2 pawns in the center versus only 1 for black. So there are typically ideas like dominating the pawn center, and he has 2 pawns in the center in the queen side versus 3 for black. So this can sometimes lead to the so-called minority attack, where white pushes his pawn minority on the queen side to try and disrupt black on that same side. For now, the two computers follow theory: bishop g5, c6, fortifying the center, e3, continuing development. Bishop comes to the long diagonal from h2 to b8. White does the same. Castle, and here white develops with knight to f3. This is perhaps the first move that is ever so slightly unusual to castle, but at the same time it's it's unusual in terms of theory, but it's a very natural move, so it can't be too far wrong. Now, if it were me, I would probably play knight g2 here in order to keep these ideas of mobilizing my center. But AlphaZero takes a different approach and plays very classically. He develops the knight to the most natural square. So black now plays rook e8, which is very logical. Another impact of the particular structure is that we notice that when these pawns get exchanged, black suddenly has a semi-open e-file in his favor, and white has a semi-open c-file in his favor. So it's natural that black would use the semi-open e-file, especially to strengthen his control over the central e4 square. White continues with castling, And now black pins the bishop. And here is the first moment that is really very, very interesting. So I just gave you guys a very, very quick, very brief introduction on what's a minority attack and the Carlsbad structure and mobilizing in the center. All of this, by the way, relates really very strongly to pawn structure. And over at Chessfactor.com, I actually created a positional chess series on pawn structure. So for those of you who are interested in exploring this subject more deeply, you guys can check that out. But for now, to return to the game, what I wanted to say is that this move rook b1 is very natural because b4, b5 is the plan, and just try to really upset black's situation here on the queen side. So this is how a human player might expect to continue, but AlphaZero takes a different approach and plays queen b3. And this is really very, very interesting move because what he says is, I don't care if you capture here on f3 and you double my pawns and you slightly open my king side. Because on the other hand, what I'm going to get is, first of all, I'm going to force you to give me the bishop, and that's going to leave me with the bishop pair, which might be useful. But more importantly, I'm going to get some strength in center and the possibility of shifting my king over to h1 and then using the g file to attack your king. So this will be, if you capture me and you ruin my structure or you damage my structure, it's a double-edged sword. Black here ignores this and plays knight to a6. Now, white continues very normally with rook e1. You're probably wondering what happens if queen takes b7, why not take this pawn? And the answer is that knight b4 leaves white in a bit of a pickle because on the one hand, the bishop is attacked, and on the other, the queen has absolutely no escape squares. These squares are covered, as you can see. And so the queen could very, very soon find herself in trouble with a move like, for example, rook e7. So therefore, black, after knight a6, white rather plays rook e1. And now black takes on the challenge, takes on f3, g takes f3, and knight to c7. Now, still capturing the pawn in this instance might seem okay because now black no longer has the move knight to b4. But the reason why it doesn't work is different this time, and it's related to the damaged pawn structure and consequent weakening of the king side for white. Black would continue with the move queen d7, and here the threat would be rook to b8, winning the queen. If white escapes with the queen, then black can use that time to play queen h3. Now there is a threat of checkmate here on h2 with a typical maneuver, which is to capture with the bishop. King will move, the bishop will drop back, king will once again move, and then queen h2 check with an eventual checkmate here on f2. So let's say that white instead played, let's say white played f4 to prevent that, then knight g4 would come along, and we see that there is once again another threat and there is no way to defend h2. So computers, as we know, are extremely tactically sharp, so white instead just played king h1. Black played g6, and white still didn't take the pawn and played f4. So this is a very interesting moment because white now gives up control of these squares, but the pawn on f4, not only does it support the bishop, which might be useful, but the main functions are, number one, this bishop here on d6 is no longer playing a part in the attack against the compromised king. And number two, this pawn here may at some point drive itself up to f5, and in so doing, try and break down the black defenses. Black here played rook b8. Now finally the pawn on b7 needed to be defended, and white continued with his kingside attacking plan. Knight came to e6, and white dragged the bishop back in order to prevent the loss of the piece. Bishop went to e7, and now something a little unusual. In the beginning, white kept the pin going, but once black actually broke the pin, white now decides to give up his bishop pair and capture on f6. But when he does this, what he's achieved is he's eliminated one of the defenders, and rather than on the previous move, where if white captured here, black would actually take with the queen, and then there would be some nice coordination of the queen and the bishop. Instead, by first playing bishop h4, forcing bishop e7, now it's the black bishop is here and the queen is still on its starting square. So this is good for white because now he doesn't have to fear that if he ever moves this pawn, that the bishop and the queen could combine against his king. So indeed he does move the pawn and plays f5. Now the knight comes to g7, and a very nice move here, queen to d1. The idea is, well, the queen already sort of did her job on b3, being very kind of annoying with this problem pawn on b7, which at any given moment could potentially be captured. And now she turns her attention to the king side instead. Black plays bishop to h4, and now queen f3 to defend against the threat of bishop takes f2. Queen comes to f6. This is a logical move by black because now f takes g6 is not an option as the queen is hit. And rook comes to g4. Black here, well, I should say white's intention is clearly to double rooks on the g file and at some point move his queen and then at some point capture. Black here plays a move that is quite ambitious. It's quite greedy and it's quite committal. And that is the move h5. He decides, well, I'm going to hit the rook, and once you're forced to go back, there will no longer be any pressure on my bishop on h4. Now the king steps away to f8, and although it's true that once black moved this pawn, the pawn on g6 becomes weaker, black figures that's not really a big deal because you can't capture because of this pin, and once you play any other move like rook g1, which is what was played, then I will simply take this pawn. This was the idea behind king f8. If in this position black took the pawn immediately, then bishop takes, queen takes, you would not be able to recapture because of the pin against the king. So rook g8, rook g2, king f8, rook ag1, and now knight takes f5. Now it looks as though AlphaZero has gone wrong because he's down a pawn, and to the human eye it may not seem like white's attack is going especially far because it seems like black still has a pretty decent structure, has a lot of pieces helping out his king. Everything seems okay. However, AlphaZero has seen deeper. The move that white now plays is queen h3, and this is a really clever point. Here's the thing. After, let's say, black's next move, which is knight to e7, because now this threat of bishop takes f5 may be possible since queen takes f5 would be met by queen takes bishop. So black moves his knight to avoid such ideas, and now the next move f4. And this position, I think, is what AlphaZero saw. So take a look at this bishop on h4. In order to get that piece back into, let's say, home turf, so to speak, in order to get that, black will need to move his queen. Because otherwise the bishop just doesn't have any squares. But unfortunately, black can't move his queen just as he pleases because the bishop is actually being defended by the queen. So in this position, black, if he ever wants to move the bishop back and sort of bring it back home, he needs to find a way to first move the knight, then move the queen, and then move the bishop. So it takes a very long time for black to sort of untangle himself. And this is what AlphaZero judged better than Stockfish. So black plays rook bd8, trying to coordinate his rooks. And now another beautiful move. If you imagine, in this position, we can see that the bishops and the rooks are coordinated, and the queen is also playing a very important role on the king side. The one piece that is not playing an important role is this knight here on c3. As you can see, it doesn't really have any jumps. Now, if you try to bring it closer, let's say here, you see that even still the jumps are not very appealing. Even if you brought it here, let's imagine that you did bring the knight here, even from there you can see that the jumps are not so appealing. So if you picture, and this is a very useful technique, try and imagine what is the best square that you could bring the knight to over on your half of the king side. And in my opinion at least, and certainly in AlphaZero's opinion, this square is f3. From there, not only are you threatening to win the bishop, but you also have some beautiful potential outposts on e5 and g5. So very nice move, knight to b1. The idea is that the knight will come to f3 via d2. So a nice backward knight move. Black plays now rook d6, knight d2 is played, knight g8. Knight g8, the idea behind this move is that now knight f3 is not an option for, at least for the next move, because rook takes e3. It would break the defense of the queen, of the pawn on e3 by the queen. So knight g8, so rook e2 is played to defend, queen e7, and now knight f3. Queen e7 was necessary because now knight f3 really was a threat, and so the idea is now black can at least step the bishop out. So we see that black did achieve what he wanted. He moved his knight, he moved his queen back, and he got his bishop out. But he had to do all of this sort of dancing, and he did it for, so far, just a pawn. In the meantime, white has a stranglehold in the center with these pawns, and all of his pieces now, including the knight, in the time that black was trying to save his bishop, white, on the other hand, brought that knight into play. And now white continues his attack. f5. And we see that now black may be starting to regret this move h5, where the pawn on g6 is suddenly a much softer target because it lacks the defense. Black played queen d7, again leveraging the undefended nature of the queen, and white simply steps away. Black now has no choice but to play g5 because he cannot take on f5 since this knight is falling, and anything else the pawn will be captured. So he plays g5 and gives back the pawn. Knight takes g5, bishop takes g5, and here black's idea is that if queen takes g5, black will put his knight on f6. At least from here it will defend h5, it will give the possibility for the black king to run away by shutting down the scope of the queen along this diagonal. And more or less, I mean, it will also block this bishop, right? So more or less, this would be a game, right? If black was able to get this. But AlphaZero plays beautiful move here, e4. So this is really a very, very nice point. And the point is that black now just doesn't have a clean response. So white has not captured the bishop immediately, but if he tries to save the bishop, if black tries to do that, the rook on d6 gets caught out with e5. And we see that there is no move for the rook. There's no other way to defend the bishop satisfactorily, and white even threatens to play first e5 and then capture the bishop. If you play d takes e4, then I capture the bishop, and the point is you still cannot take this piece because in fact either on g7 or g8 it will be checkmate, so you must play knight f6. But now the fact that white forced black to play d takes e4 means that there's a lot more action going on in this e-file, and also a lot more scope for this bishop on this long diagonal between a2 and g8. So this is very, very unpleasant and indeed lost. One sample line is king e7, bishop takes f7 is a really nice shot. The point is if king takes bishop, then queen g7 is checkmate. And if you don't do this, if you do something like rook f8, I'll plant the bishop on e6, and this is really horrific, with moves like rook takes e4 or queen g7 coming up soon. So therefore after e4, black found the best move, which is rook takes e4, but this is really a big victory for AlphaZero because this is Stockfish having to give up an exchange. So white captured the exchange, d takes e4, and still here in this position, if I go queen takes g5, there is this possibility of knight f6. So to rob black of that square, AlphaZero plays h4. This is a beautiful move again. The point is, if you do move this bishop, the knight on g8 will fall. And if you go knight f6 now, I will be able to take on g5 with my pawn, and I will control the f6 square, and that will dislodge your knight from that important square. So therefore after h4, black found nothing better than knight h6. Now that the knight can no longer come to this important square of f6, white took on g5. queen takes f5 was played, queen takes f5, knight takes f5, rook takes e4. Finally, the dust has settled, and in the end, what started as a pawn sacrifice by AlphaZero ended with AlphaZero being an exchange up, because Stockfish was unable to deal with all of the problems associated with having won that pawn. So really a very, very interesting game, a beautiful handling of what is a very, very well-known opening, which is the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation, and indeed structure, which is the Carlsbad structure. So very, very interesting approach, very interesting way of playing, and well, perhaps not as flashy as some of the other AlphaZero versus Stockfish games, but overall I think super, super instructive and super interesting. So hope you guys enjoyed this. By the way, for those of you who are curious, AlphaZero had no difficulties converting this position. I can absolutely blitz through the remaining 30 or so moves. It was just a little bit of maneuvering and dancing around. For a human player to convert an endgame like this with the exchange up, but black having a couple of pawns, would be very, very difficult, and especially with a tricky knight. But for an engine, you know, if it's a win, they'll find it. So here, as you can see at this point, Stockfish resigned, and that was that. So, okay, that concludes our coverage of game one. I hope you've enjoyed it, and well, see you guys in the next video.